So 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is releasing soon on the Nintendo Switch, and I had the opportunity to check it out and give you guys my impressions of the game so far. So disclaimer, I'm only allowed to talk about the prologue, unfortunately, which is about the first 3 or so hours of the game. But I can already tell that this is one of the more interesting stories. I've never played a Vanillaware game before. This is the first one I've ever played, and I think it's just great. It starts off as sort of like a normal school life kind of thing, but it eventually really shows you the scope of the story and just how wild things can get. The first thing is that a lot of different characters that you play as are in different periods of time. So you'll have someone that's like in 1940 or 1980, then you have people who are further in the future who are way back in the past. And it's just, when you talk about time and stuff like that, when you talk about time in a story, that's when things get really interesting. And the game so far has proven that it's not just that. It's not just on the surface. It will really blow your mind. I've had my world shattered playing this game. It's one of the weirdest games I've played in terms of story structure. And at the same time, the structure is so interesting because they'll tell it in a way where it almost feels like you're watching like a TV show or something, where the individual segments are broken up into like 5 or 10 minute sections, and then it'll end off with like a to be continued after something crazy happens, and you can continue on directly after, or you can move on to another character. Yes, this game has multiple protagonists. They all have their own story going on, and they're all really interesting. In my honest opinion, every single character in this game is interesting, and as I continue on their stories, I get invested in their specific plot point, but then I have to move on to another character, and then I have to familiarize myself with them, and as I learn more and more about them, I realize, well, they're pretty interesting too. So yeah, every character so far is really good. They all have their own thing going on, and in the grand scheme of things, I think at some point they're going to come together in the future. Like I said, I haven't finished the game yet. I've only played a little bit on the PS4, so this is still somewhat new to me. But what I'm trying to say is that the story is extremely interesting, and it's something that I just did not expect going in. And I think most people who play this game are going to go in expecting something or having certain expectations, and they're just going to be blown out of the water because the story goes places that I would have never imagined. I don't think I've played a story that has had me this interested since like Persona 5 or Persona 4 Golden. It's extremely interesting, but at the same time, I do find the story a little hard to follow just because there's so much going on in between all of these characters that you have to play as, and you kind of need to remember certain things. So what I found myself doing was just like video capturing a bunch of stuff just so I can go back and rewatch it and familiarize myself with certain concepts so that when it gets brought up again later in the story, I'll know what they're talking about. Of course, I'll get more into the story with the review of the game, which I'll have coming out really soon, but so far I'm really enjoying the story. Now, more on the gameplay itself, there are 2 modes in this game. I say modes. One is where you're fighting against the kaiju as the Sentinels, and then the other is where you are kind of just experiencing the story as the human playable character, whichever one you pick. There's a ton of them. And the gameplay, when it comes to the story section, it pretty much consists of just you walking around and talking to the right people and exploring, settings like a school, maybe like a city at night, things like that. And you're just going to be talking to people, and just as you talk to the right people, it'll sort of just further the plot. There's also a really cool detail where you can hear the character's thoughts. If you press a button, you can select from a list of words that, you might have heard throughout conversations, and you can hear the character's thoughts on that specific word. Sometimes that'll be necessary to continue through the story, or that'll be necessary to bring up to a certain character so that they'll respond to a certain thing accordingly. It's a pretty cool system. I really have no complaints with it. It's really nice, it's really intuitive, and it also really helps with the storytelling because you can hear what's going on in the main character's thoughts, what they think about a certain subject at any given point in time, and I think that's awesome. What also helps is the really great voice acting. This game has a ton of dialogue, so I'm happy that this game has really good voice acting, and they have a lot of big name voice actors. You recognize a lot of them from video games and anime, and they all did a great job here. Now to talk about the gameplay of the battle portion, which is where you play as the characters who are inside the Sentinels fighting the kaiju. It's kind of a tactical strategy type game where it's top down and you have a huge area, a huge view of the city, and that's basically your battlefield. The battle system itself is pretty in-depth and there's a lot to learn, but unfortunately a lot of the mechanics is something that's talked about after the prologue, so I can't talk about it here. The battle system itself is kind of fun. Like, it's not my favorite when it comes to this kind of thing. I've never been a fan of like sort of top-down strategy type games, and I do find myself wanting to play more of the story than I do wanting to play the battle system. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the battle system, it just doesn't really appeal to me that much. But if you are an existing fan of this kind of thing, then there's a lot to like here. Blowing up enemies is pretty satisfying, I will admit, and you do have a ton of different ways to do so. You can select from a list of skills, and some of them have an area of effect that target like a circle that's around you, or you can have like an attack that affects enemies that are like in a cone pattern in front of you, or you have an attack that can just blast through enemies in a straight line. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about destroying enemies, destroying the kaiju, and things like that, and it's pretty satisfying to see them explode. What's also satisfying, at least in the beginning section, is the performance for the Switch version. Now, I was worried that this game would have issues running on a Switch because battles can get pretty hectic later on, and at least at the beginning section, the frame rate does seem to be pretty good. It's 60 FPS, it targets 60 FPS, but there are drops, and later on in the story, battles can get really crazy and you can definitely see the frame rate drop. But outside of battles, the game is essentially a 60 FPS game almost all the way through, and it hasn't really affected my enjoyment of the game at all. I can still enjoy the story, I can still enjoy the battles for what they are, and so far, like, this game is just proven to be a much better game than I expected it was going to be. And I think at this point I'm going to have to look at other Vanillaware titles to see what else they've made, because this game has blown away my expectations. But that's all I have to say on 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim on a Nintendo Switch. My review will be out on this game really soon, so make sure you subscribe to GameXplain and ring the bell for a lot more on 13 Sentinels and other things gaming too. Until next time.